Authorization. So firstly, let's recap. In the previous session, we have seen about navigating to a specific block using the path parameters. We also have covered about the route props, of which we have seen about the match object, right? So coming to today's session, in today's session, we are going to cover about authentication and authorization, which are important steps involved in the client-server communication. We'll understand about these. And then we are going to build an e-commerce application. We'll add an authentication flow to it, okay? And then we'll also understand about the history object, which is a route parameter. Okay, so let's get started. So to set the code playground for today's session, you need to run this command. So then the code playground will be set for today's session. And then run npm install, then all the dependencies will get installed. Okay, so now let's understand about authentication and authorization. Okay, so starting with authentication. So authentication is actually a process to verify the user's identity. Okay, generally in the applications, what do? We enter the username, password, right? And then, or it could be phone number or OTP or say email or password, right? Then the application will verify those details. That process is nothing but called as authentication. So whenever we enter those details, so we are being authenticated. That is, we are being verified. That is whether the details that we have provided are valid or not. So that process is nothing but authentication. Okay. So then the details that we have entered, right? So the username, the password, or it could be the phone number, OTP, or any details like this. So then a login request. Okay, generally we call this login. Technically, it's nothing but authentication. So that request will be sent to the server. Okay, then the server will verify those details, and if they are valid, it will send a JWT token as a response. Okay, clear? So you understood this step, right? So authentication is the process of verifying those login details, verifying the user's identity. Okay, clear? So now we understood about authentication, right? Now let's understand about authorization. Okay, after the user is authenticated, so he can access various resources, right? So the step of verifying whether he is permitted to access the resources or perform some actions on the resources, that is authorization. Okay, so that is a process of verifying whether the user has permissions to do some actions. Okay, that is authorization. In authentication, we verify the user. Okay, so once the user is verified, then the next step would be whether the user has permissions to access particular resources. That is authorization. Okay, so you understood the difference here. So in authentication, we verify the user's identity. In authorization, we check whether the user has permissions or not. Okay, that is authorization. Okay, generally when it comes to applications, there will be various roles involved. Okay, various roles, like let's say creating a particular resource, reading, accessing, like this, there'll be different actions. Okay, so based on the role of the user, so few users will be having permissions to create some resources. So few will have permissions to create, to update the resources, like this, right? So the permissions could vary, right? So verifying whether the user is permitted to create or permitted to update, permitted to do a particular action, that is nothing but authorization. Okay, clear? So in authentication, we check who the user is, right? The user's identity. In authorization, we check whether the user is allowed to do that or not, whether he has permission to do that or not. Okay, so that's the difference between the authentication and authorization. Okay, so now let's understand the steps involved in the client-server communication. Okay, so initially when the user is accessing the application, so firstly he'll provide the username, password, or it could be phone number, OTP, or email or password. So whichever the login details are required. So he'll provide that. So then a login request, that is an authentication request, will be sent to the server. Okay, with the details that he has entered. So then the server will verify whether the details are valid, whether there's an account present with that, whether the password is valid or not. All these verifications will be done on the server side. Okay, so if the details are valid, okay, then the server will create a JWT token, okay, and then will send it as a response to the client. Okay, so you understood this step. A login request will be sent to the server. The server will check the details. If they are valid, it will send a JWT token as a response. Okay, now on the client side, we have to store that JWT token. Okay, so why do we have to store that? So that in the subsequent request, in the next request that we do to the server, we will add this JWT token and send, so that the server will be able to check whether the user has permissions or not. So for that, so the JWT token will be stored on the client side, and in the subsequent request, that JWT token will be added in the request and will be sent to the server. Okay, then the server will appropriately verify and then will appropriately send the response to the client. So these are the steps involved in the communication between the client and the server. Okay, so first step is the authentication, right? So verifying whether the user is valid or not. So then later on, the next steps would involve authorization, that is checking whether they have the permissions to access those requests or access those resources or perform some actions, right? So those are nothing but authorization. Okay, clear? So now let's have a look at the e-commerce application that we are going to build. Okay, so here this e-commerce application that we are going to build is a single page application. We understood about multi-page and single page applications, right? So the application that we are going to build is a single page application. Okay, clear? So in this, there'll be various routes, right? In case of single page application, we will have a single page, whereas the components that we are going to render will vary based on the path, right? So here you can see the login route. So here we are calling this a login route, not a login page. The reason is it's a single page application, right? And so we'll only have a single page, but the components will vary. So those are nothing but the login route. So based on the path that we are accessing, so the route that we are going to render will vary, right? Okay, so here you can see the login route. So if you access /login, so this should be displayed. Okay, clear? So now this is the home route. Okay, there you can see. And then we have the products route, which displays the list of products. So there you can see, right? Now to view the details of a specific product, we have the product route. There you can see, right? And then there is also a cart route. Okay, so to view generally in an e-commerce application, so we'll have a cart to view all the details, all the products that we want to buy, right? So that is the cart route. Okay, clear? So you understood these details, right? These are very common in an e-commerce application, right? So firstly, we will log in and then we'll have a home page. Then we'll have the list of products and we'll view a particular product, add to a cart. And then in the cart, we'll be displaying the list of products that we have added to the cart, right? So this is the e-commerce application that we are going to build, okay? So here in this particular let's understand about the authentication flow. Okay, so the authentication flow is common among a lot of applications, right? That could be an e-commerce application where we log in, right? Or it could be some Netflix application, or it could be some Redbus, any application. So initially, what do? We log in, right? That is nothing but the authentication flow, right? So let's understand this authentication flow in the front-end applications. Okay, so firstly, we'll enter the details, right? Say username, password. Okay, then a request will be sent to the server. Let's call that login request. Okay, so that will be sent to the server. So then the server will verify the details and send a response. In case the details are valid, so in the response, the server will send the JWT token. So we have to show an error message. And in case if the API call is successful, okay, so then the JWT token will be sent in the response, right? So we have to store that JWT token, and also we want to navigate to the home route. Okay, clear? So you understood these steps. Firstly, we'll send a login request, then we'll get a response. So in case the response is a success response, then we'll store the JWT token, and then we'll also navigate to the home route. In case if the response is a failure response, so then we have to show the error message. Okay, so these are the various things that we have to implement in the authentication flow. Okay, so let's implement this authentication flow in React. Okay, so for this, there's some initial code available for you. There are different components that are already available. So there you can see there's a cart component, header, home, login, products, like this. There are various components already available for you. Okay, so then you can see the initial code here. So this is the app.js. So there you can see there are various routes for login. So we are displaying the login form, right? So for the path / we are displaying the home, right? Like this, there are various routes available there. Okay, so this is the initial code. Okay, so you can see the login form now. So this is the login form component. So where we are storing the username and password, okay, in the state object. So then in case of the change of username and password, so we are updating the state object. All this flow is already present. Okay, and then if you run npm start and access localhost :3000, you'll be able to view the home route. Okay, clear? Now let's have a look at this. So here you can see, right, in the source, there are various components available. So here you can see in the components, we have cart, header, home, login form like this, and then products like this. And then there's app.js, so where we have the application logic, right? So here you can see we have app, so in the browser router. So and then we have the switch, so where we have handle various parts. So for login, we are displaying the login form. For / it's the home. For products, the products, and cart, all these are present. So right now we are discussing about the authentication flow. So let's have a look at the login form component. Okay, so in the components we have login form. So let's have a look at that component. Okay, so this is the login form component. So here in the state, we are maintaining the username and password as they change over the time, right? So when the user is entering, so the username and password, initially they'll be empty, then the user will enter something and then will log in, right? So these will change over the time. So we are maintaining that in the state. Okay, so next you can see that firstly, let's go to render method. So here you can see this is the render method. So this is the login form container, then we are having some details. So this is the form container. So here you can see we are rendering the username and password fields. So here in the username and password, so here you can see we are displaying the username element and then the password element. And in case of change of password, we are calling the onChange password method. And in case of change of username, we are calling the onChange username method, right? Okay, so here you can see an onChange username and onChange password. So based on the username that's been updated, so we are setting the state, okay, so that appropriately the next things we can perform. Okay, clear? So this is the initial code available for us. Okay, you can also once go through the code and understand, right? Because the next thing will be based on this particular aspect. Okay, so now if you run npm start, so I'm running npm start. With this, my server will get started. So here, so let's access the various things. So if you access /login, you'll be able to see this output. So there you can see this is the login route. Okay, and in case if you access /, so that is the home route, right? There you can see this is the home route. Okay, clear? So like this, there are various routes available. So right now we are focusing on these two. Okay, clear? So we understood the initial code, right? So we understood the login form component, and also we understood the logic, the different routes and the how we are routing that. Okay. So we have seen this output and the login route also, where the path is /login. Okay, so now let's add authentication flow to this. Okay, so let's understand the various steps involved. So the first step is we have to make an authentication request to the login API, right? The initial login request has to be sent to the server, right? So that is the first step. And then we'll get a response from the server. So we have to handle that response. In case of success, so we have to handle the success response, and in case of failure, we have to handle the failure response, right? So those are the next steps involved. So after that, in case of success, we also have to store the JWT token. Okay, so we have to do that step. So these are the various steps involved in the authentication flow. Okay, so let's start with the first step, that is making an authentication request to the login API. Okay, so let's do that. So for that, we understood the initial code of the login form, right? So in the state, we are maintaining the username and password, and in case of change of username or password, we are updating the state. And then based on that, all the UI will be rendered, all the steps will follow, right? So now the next thing is when the user clicks on the login button, so we have to make the authentication request, right? So for that, if you observe, so the entire login thing is a form, right? So for form, as we previously understood, we have on submit. Okay, so on submit is an event. Okay, so with this, there you can see for the form, we are writing on submit equal to, and then we are giving an event listener this dot submit form. So in that method submit form, so we have event is being passed as an argument. So there we are doing event dot prevent default. Okay, so the prevent default method is actually used is previously we understood about forms, right? So where prevent default is a method, we call it to avoid the default behavior that happens. Okay, generally previously we have seen that the website will crash like this, right? So to avoid that default process, so we are going to call this prevent default method. Okay, we have seen about this previously when we were discussing about forms. So in case it's not in your active memory, you can always go back and then have a look at that the cheat sheet, then you'll be able to easily recall those concepts. Okay, so here for that particular form, we want a submit action, right? So we have on submit equal to and the event listener, so where we are preventing the default, okay, thing. Okay, clear? So now, so let's do these steps. So here, if you observe, in the render method, you can see that this entire thing is actually a form, right? In which we are displaying the username, password, and finally we have the login button. So for this also, you can see that the type is submit. So this is actually the submit button. So by clicking on this button, so the submit on submit event will get triggered. So let's add the event listener for this. So on submit. So with this on submit, so we want to basically prevent the default behavior, right? So let's add an event listener for this. So this dot on submit form. Okay, so here we are going to add that event listener for this. So let's go here. This is all rendering part. So here I'm going to add that. So equal to, so the event will be passed as an argument. So here I'm going to call prevent default. Okay, clear? So we are done with these steps, right? So this is on clicking on the submit button, since the type is equal to submit. So this login button is actually the submit button. So on clicking on this, right? So the on submit event will get triggered. So this particular event listener will be called. So where we are preventing the default. Okay, clear? So after this, so once we click on the login button, so what do we have to do? We have to send a request to the login API. So the API that we are going to call is login user API. So here you can see, as we previously understood for the login API, so the method would be post, because we have to send the username and password, right? So that's the reason we are using the post. So then the URL there you can see apis.ccpp.in/login, and then coming to the body. So in the body, we'll send the username and the password that the user has entered. Okay, clear? So there's the request. For this, as a response, in case of success, the JWT token will be sent. Okay, So now let's write the steps involved. Okay, so firstly, in the submit, so we have to access the username and password from the state. Okay, and then so with this we have the user details. So now we have to make an API call. So for this, firstly, the URL, we have to set the URL, and then also the options, right? So we have to send URL and the options to the fetch. So in the options, you can see the method is post, and the body, we are sending the user details by stringifying it, right? There you can see the method is post, and in the body, we are sending the user details. So now the next thing is making the API call, right? So fetch of URL comma options. So with this, we'll get a response. So then we have to convert that into a JSON. So there you can see we are converting that into a JSON, and finally we are getting the data. So in case if you provide the credentials in this manner, say username Rahul and password as Rahul@2021. So these are the valid details. So for this, okay, so the API call would be a success, and we will get a JWT token as a response in this manner. Okay, clear? Let's do these steps involved. So now what we are going to do, we are going to make a authentication request, that is a login request. Okay, so for that, so firstly, let's get the details ready. So firstly, we need the username and password. So let's access them from the state. So username, password equal to this dot state. So from the state, we are accessing the username and password. The next thing is we have to create the user details that we have to send in the body. So that is nothing but the username and the password, right? So with this, we'll have the user details. Okay, so the next thing is, since we are using await, so this should be async. Okay, so with this we'll get a response. Okay, now we have to convert that response into a JSON. So that will again be a promise object. So response.json. So with this we will get the data. So then let's display the data. Okay, so we have the URL and we have the options. So to the fetch method, we are sending the URL and the options, and then we have the response. Then we are converting that into a JSON, and we are storing that in the data, and finally we are displaying the data, right? Okay, so this is the step involved with the request, right? Login request. Okay, we are done with those things, and we are actually getting the response too. So now let's try this out. So now let's access the login route. So /login will give us a login route. Okay, so now let's just do inspect, and we'll see the console. So now here we have to provide the username and password, right? So now let me say give mine. So the username is Pranita, and then let's say Pranita@2021. Okay, I'm providing this. So now I'll click on login. Okay, so with this you can see that the login request was successful, and we got the JWT token in the response. Okay, there you can see. Clear? Okay, so we are done with making the login request, right? And we got this response. So we are done with this first step. Next, so we got a response. Now we have to handle this response. Right now we have the success response, right? So let's handle that. So when the server response is successful, we want to navigate to the home route. Okay, so we have to do that step. So let's see how to do that. Okay, so when we are making this fetch and we with the HTTP request, so you can see that we have OK. In the response, we will have OK key, for which we'll have a value as either true or false. Okay, so this will be present in the response object. So once we make the request, so we'll get a response. So in the response object, so we'll have an OK key to which we'll have either true or false. So if the API call was a success, so then the value would be true. If it's a failure, then the value would be false. Okay, clear? So we can make use of this to understand whether the API call was a success or a failure. Okay, so if the response status was 2xx, that is 201 or 200 like this, right? So then the response.ok will be true, otherwise it will be false. Okay, so we understood this thing, right? So now if you display the response, so if you do console log, right, there you can see for OK we have true. Okay, that means it's a success, right? So the login API was a success. Okay, so now what do we want to do? So we want to navigate to the home route, right? So that is what we want to do. So firstly, if the response.ok is true, then we are calling the onSubmit success, where in the onSubmit success, we want to navigate to the home route. So let's understand how to navigate to a particular route. Okay, so right now we are in the login route, right? So now we have to navigate to the home route. So in login, the path is /login. So whereas for the home route, the path would be /. So from /login, we have to navigate to /, right? So let's understand how to do this. Okay, so for this, we have history object. Okay, so the React router will provide some additional props, right? Of which one is the history object. Okay, so in the history object, we'll have some methods to control the navigation in the browser. Okay, so the React router will send and this history object as a prop. Okay, so using this, we can control the navigation in the browser. Okay, like here in our case, we want to move from slash login to slash. Like this, we can control this navigation in the browser with the help of this history object. Another additional thing that this history object does is it will maintain the history of the routes that we have navigated, right? So so from here to here we have moved, right? So from here to here we have moved, right? So that entire history will also be maintained by the history object. Okay, so basically the history object will give us some methods using which we can control the navigation in the browser, and also it will maintain the history. So this is actually the additional prop passed by the route. So just like how we have match, right? Similarly, history is another prop passed by the route. Okay, and then there'll be several methods to control the navigation in the browser. So there is push, replace, right, and then go back. Like this, there are various methods available to control the navigation. In today's session, we are going to see about push and replace. Okay, so let's understand about these methods. So using the history.push and history.replace, we can navigate to the other routes programmatically. That is through code, we can navigate to different routes, right? So we can navigate to different routes with the help of these methods, the push and replace. So let's understand each of these. Starting with push, okay? So history.push off, and you will provide the path to which you want to navigate. Okay, so with this is, you can see that, so initially we have a slash login. So, and then we can navigate to slash by providing that path to the history.push method. Okay, another additional benefit with this history.push is, so user can go forward and backward in the browser whenever the URL will change. Okay, so here you can see, right? So from slash login, we want to go to slash, right? So if you make use of the push method, then using that forward and backward, we can go back to the login, and then we can again go forward to the home. Like this, we can navigate between the different URLs with the help of this push method. Okay, clear? So if you use the push method, you can navigate between the different routes. Okay, clear? So initially, let's say you have a new tab. Let's understand more in detail. Initially, let's say you have a new tab. Okay, now you have accessed localhost :3000/login. Now in the history, you can see that that particular URL is being maintained. Okay, so now the history.push of slash has been called. Okay, so the push method has been called, and now we want to navigate to slash. So we have moved to localhost :3000/, and in the history, an additional path that we have navigated has been added. So there you can see localhost :3000. Now let's say we want to go back. So in the history, we'll go back to the slash login, and now let's say we want to go forward, right? So then it will go to localhost :3000, the slash path. Okay, so in this way, we can go backward and forward with the help of this push method. Okay, clear? So let's try this out. So there you can see on submit success. So we want to navigate to the slash. So we are going to make use of the history. Okay, so that will be passed in the props. Okay, so from this .props, we are accessing the history object. So history.push of slash. So with this, we will navigate to the home route. Okay, clear? Now let's try this out. So firstly, as we understood, so on submit success, right? So this is the login route. So here we are submitting the form and we are making the request. So now when the API call is successful, so then we want to navigate to the home route, right? So this is where we are. Okay, so that will be present in the response object. Okay, so if you do console.log, so response. So here, so once I'll enter some details, say Pranita, and then let's say Pranita @2021. So if I log in, okay, so here in the response, you can observe that we have OK: true. Okay, so this will mention whether the API call was a success or a failure. So using this, we can understand whether the login request was successful or not. So we have seen that the login request was successful, right? Now what do we want to do? Once the login request was successful, we want to navigate to the home route. So let's do those steps. So firstly, so from the response, we'll understand whether it's successful or not using response.ok. So if it is true, so then what do we have to do? We have to navigate to the home route. So let's call a method on login success. Okay, so let's write this. So here, what do we want to do, right? So we want to navigate to the home route, right? So for that, as we understood, we have a history object. So using which we can navigate to different routes, right? So this history object is present in the props. So in the app.js, so we are using route, and then that's how we have come to the login, right? So this route will send some additional props like match, history, like this, location and all. So right now we want the history. So we can access this with the props. Okay, so constant history, this dot props. Okay, so now in the history object, so there are various methods available, right? So one of which is push. Using this, we can navigate to different paths. So right now we want to navigate to home, that is slash, right? So with history.push, we will navigate to the home route, right? Okay, so let's try this out. So firstly, so I'll enter some details. So firstly, the login request should be successful, right? So now I'm clicking on login, right? So there you can see now we have navigated to the home route, and there you can see. So from /login we have come to /, right? Okay. So in this way, we can navigate to a different routes with the help of this history.push, right? So here you can see that another benefit with the push is we can go backward and forward, right? So here you can see. So right now we are in home. So previously we have come from the path /login. So if you click on back, so we can go back to the /login, okay? Similarly, so if you want to go forward, right? So which is home. So you can click on this and you can go forward, okay? So in this way, you can make use of this forward and backward, okay? Clear? So we understood about the push method of the history object, right? And we have seen this output where we can go backward and forward when we use the push. Another method is replace, history.replace of path. Using this also we can navigate to different paths, right? But replace will actually replace the current URL with the new one that we have provided, okay? So it will completely replace it. It won't add it. It won't add a new URL. It will replace the current URL. So that's the reason we can't go back to the previous URL. Okay, we can't go back to the previous URL because it is replacing the current URL. So let's say we have provided dot replace of /. So then the /login will be replaced with /. So then what will happen? So the current URL has been replaced. So the previous URL history will not be maintained. So we cannot go back to the previous URL. Okay, so there you can see in a new tab. So we have entered localhost :3000 /login, right? So here we are going to the login route, right? So then the history.replace of / has been called. So then what will happen? So the current URL will be replaced with the /, right? So there you can see the current URL has been replaced with localhost :3000 /. So then what will happen? Can we go back? No, we cannot go back to the previous URL because it has been replaced. Okay, so now let's try this out too. So there you can see instead of push, so we have written replace them. Okay, so with this we cannot go back to the previous URL. So there you can see once we log in, right? So we will navigate to the home route and then we cannot go back to the login. Okay, clear? So based on our requirement, so there you can see we have gone back to the Google because that's the last one. So based on our requirement, so we have to either use the push or the replace. Okay, clear? Let's try this out. So here we have history.push. Instead, let's try replace. Okay, so now, so let's access /login. Okay, so I'm providing some details. So there you can see now I'm in the home. So now if I try to go back, so there you can see I cannot go back anymore. So the reason is we are not going back to the login route. The reason is the current URL has been replaced. Okay, so here you need to understand one important thing. When to use push, when to use replace. See, for in our particular case, right? So once the user has logged in, right, he need not go back to the login page, right? So if he really wants to go back to the login page, he has to just log out with this. He'll go back to the login page. Once the user has logged in, there's no need of the login page again, right? So in that case, we can directly make use of the history.replace method. But in case if you are navigating between different paths, and then let's say now he wants to go back, right? So in such scenarios, we can make use of the push method. Okay, so based on our requirement, we either use the push or the replace. Okay, clear? So we have seen this output too, right? So in today's session, we have seen about making an authentication request to the login API, and also we have handled the success response, right? In the next session, we will see how to handle the login, a failure, and also how to store the JWT token, authentication and authorization, which is part of client-server communication. Then we have added authentication flow to the e-commerce application. We also understood about the history object, which is a route parameter. So this is what we have seen in today's session.